Okay, let's dive into this. Picture it. London in the 1880s. A thick, choking fog rolls off the murky waters of the River Thames. It's blanketing a city that's, rapidly expanding, but also deeply divided by class. And it's hiding some incredibly dark secrets in its shadows. Now, while the world mostly remembers this era for the absolute hysteria surrounding Jack the Ripper, there was actually another predator operating entirely unnoticed right in the background. Today, we're looking at one of the most chilling, calculated, and honestly forgotten series of crimes in Victorian history, the Thames Torso Murders. To really understand how these crimes stayed unsolved for so long, you first kind of have to understand the river itself. There's this famous quote by the British Member of Parliament John Burns. He once told an American congressman, "The Mississippi is muddy water, but the Thames is liquid history." But listen, that history, it isn't just, royal processions and maritime trade. For centuries, the Thames acted as literally a liquid graveyard. It was this massive dumping ground for the city's refuse, a tragic final destination for the desperate, and, as we're about to see, absolutely the perfect accomplice for a serial killer. The river washed away evidence, it distorted timelines, and it scattered the pieces of a horrifying puzzle all across the capital. Part 1. A gruesome puzzle. So, that gruesome puzzle began to surface in May of 1887, over in Raynham, which is a little village in the Thames River Valley. There was a lighterman named Edward Hughes. Basically, his job was ferrying goods to and from ships on barges. Anyway, he notices this strange, super heavy canvas sack just bobbing in the murky water near the Victoria docks. Naturally, hoping he'd snagged some lost, valuable cargo, he pulls it ashore. But instead of stolen goods, he found the torso of a woman. When Dr. Edward Calloway actually examined the remains, his findings were just chilling. The victim had been dead for over 2 weeks, sure, but the dismemberment is what really alarmed the medical community. The body hadn't just been hacked apart in some crazy frenzy. No, it had been severed precisely at the lumbar vertebrae. Dr. Calloway noted the killer used a really sharp saw and a keen-edged knife, showing what he called an intimate knowledge of anatomy. This definitely wasn't a crime of sudden, blind passion. It was deliberate, clinical, and just terrifyingly organized. Part 2. Taunting Scotland Yard. If the Raynham murder was the killer, sort of testing the waters, 1888 showed a terrifying leap in confidence. The killer decided to strike right at the very heart of British law enforcement. They weren't just disposing of bodies anymore, they were making a massive statement. Just look at the timeline of the Whitehall mystery. On September 11th, an arm was found washed up on the muddy Pimlico shore. At first, the press just totally dismissed it as a crude prank by some medical students. But then, on October 2nd, a headless torso was discovered. And the location here is what makes it so unbelievably brazen. It was found in the vault of the construction site for the new Scotland Yard building. Let that sink in. The killer literally dropped a decomposing torso into the future headquarters of the Metropolitan Police. Then a couple weeks later, on October 17th, a left leg was found buried nearby. This guy was treating the victim's remains like objects in some twisted, macabre game, just handing out pieces to the authorities at his own pace. And to add absolute insult to injury for the police, get this. Consider how that final piece was actually found. The left leg buried near the construction site. It wasn't uncovered by Scotland Yard's highly trained bloodhounds, even though they've been scouring the exact same area for days. No way. It was dug up by a Spitzbergen dog that belonged to a newspaper reporter named Jasper Waring. Talk about a complete humiliation for the authorities. The whole thing was playing out very publicly in the press, while the killer just remained perfectly hidden right in plain sight. Part 3. Naming the Nameless. So after Whitehall, the killer basically vanishes for months. But then, in June of 1889, the horror resumes with this really twisted sense of theatrality. Another sequence of body parts starts appearing in the Thames. And get this, one victim's remains were purposely thrown over the private estate railing of Mary Shelley. Yes, the author of Frankenstein, a novel literally famous for a monster pieced together from human body parts. You couldn't write a more sinister detail. But this time, the killer actually made a mistake. Wrapped around some remains found beneath Albert Bridge was a fragment of a lady's overcoat. And beautifully embroidered right on that coat was the name L.E. Fisher. That single, absolutely crucial clue gave the police exactly what they needed. It led them to identify the victim as 24-year-old Elizabeth Jackson, a homeless woman from Chelsea. And tragically, the medical examiners discovered that Elizabeth had been about 8 months pregnant at the time of her murder. Out of all these cases, she is the only victim of the Thames Torso series to ever actually be given her name back. Part 4. The Ripper Connection. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it brings us right into Jack the Ripper's backyard. Because by September of 1889, a headless torso was found on Pinchin Street in Whitechapel. That is the exact same neighborhood Jack the Ripper had completely drenched in blood just a year prior. Naturally, the city immediately panicked, assuming Jack had returned. But if we visually pit these two killers against each other, honestly, their methods are night and day. Jack the Ripper left his victims at the scene. His attacks were these frenzied, chaotic events, characterized by progressive abdominal and genital mutilation. The torso killer, on the other hand, terrifyingly organized. This killer used neat disarticulation, cleanly dividing complex joints without splintering bone, and treated the disposal of the body like a deliberate spread-out puzzle. Leading medical experts at the time, like Dr. Thomas Bond and Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, completely debunked the Ripper connection. They knew for sure they were dealing with two entirely distinct monsters. In fact, the distinction between the two was so clear that even Jack the Ripper, or, well, at least the person claiming to be him in letters to the press, wanted to make absolutely sure no one confused their work. In a letter sent to the Central News Agency, the alleged Ripper specifically distanced himself from the Thames Murders. He wrote, "I swear I did not kill the female whose body was found at Whitehall." Now, whether that was actually written by the real killer or just some sensationalist journalist trying to sell papers, it really highlights how incredibly distinct the two murder series were in the minds of Victorian Londoners.
So if it wasn't the Ripper, who on earth was it? Well, the kind of medical knowledge required to neatly disarticulate a spine without hacking the bone led a lot of people to suspect a rogue surgeon, or maybe an anatomist. Others pointed to a butcher or a hunter who was just super used to carving carcasses. But modern researchers, like the historian Sarah Bax Horton, have proposed a really fascinating new suspect, a Thames waterman named James Crick. Think about it. A waterman would know the river's tides intimately. That knowledge would allow them to perfectly calculate exactly where and when to drop a bundle so it would wash up precisely where they wanted to leave their next gruesome puzzle piece. It makes a lot of sense, right?
Part 5. The Enduring Mystery. And this brilliantly illustrates just how massive the scope of these crimes really was.
This mystery is just incredibly sprawling. While we're left with 4 quote-unquote canonical torso victims from the 1887 to 1889 series, there are actually earlier, remarkably similar cases on the books. For instance, in 1873, the Battersea Mysteries saw a woman skillfully dismembered and dropped along the river. And then in 1884, the Tottenham Court Road Mystery involved body parts left in parcels right on the street. It begs this absolutely terrifying question. Was this killer operating completely unchecked for over a decade? Despite the sheer terror they caused, despite the horrific taunting of Scotland Yard, and honestly despite the incredible skill of the murderer, these women were almost entirely overshadowed by the media frenzy surrounding Jack the Ripper. The tragic stories and the identity of the person who brutally deconstructed them just kind of faded into the dark, muddy margins of history. Even today, as mudlarks comb the shores of the Thames, pulling up old Victorian artifacts, and historians try to piece together century-old documents, the shadow of the torso killer still remains. We know the what, we know the where, and we definitely know the how, but the who, that's still buried. Which leaves us with one final pretty haunting thought. Will the murky, liquid history of the River Thames ever truly give up its darkest secrets? Or will the torso killer forever remain just a ghost in the fog?